Page 59. A rule comes to, and the fox is trying to talk the king out of sacrificing his daughter.
Say 59?
Yes. And he says, "But master, I'd lose not only my throne, but my life to save the princess, if I were a king and a father. Let us fight. Arm the slaves and promise them their freedom if they play the man. We can make a stand. At the worst, we should all die innocent, better than going down yonder with a daughter's blood on your hands." Okay, now, what did he tell Arul earlier? There is no going down yonder. Okay?
But, needs must.
But what might he be thinking of? Talking about going down yonder with a daughter's death on your daughter's blood on your hands. How many of you are very familiar with Greek mythology or the Trojan War? Curse of the House of Atreus. Why? Because Agamemnon does what before he goes off to fight in the Trojan War? He sacrifices his daughter Iphigenia at Aulis, a port. Okay, goes off to the Trojan War, comes back. His wife Clytemnestra and her boyfriend, starts with an A, never remember his name. They kill him. His son Orestes then kills them. Okay, and it all goes back to the house of Atreus, who are a bunch of bloodthirsty, murdering people. So he says, line up the slaves. And what does the king do? The king flings himself once more into his chair, begins speaking, says, "I have a king. I've asked you for counsel." That's not good counsel. Okay? To die and lose my kingdom. Okay? So, Arul says, "King, the blood of the gods is in us," page 60. "Can such a house as ours bear the shame?" "How will it sound if men say when you are dead that you took shelter behind a girl to save your own life?" And the king's like, "You see what nonsense you've put into her head? Is it any wonder I slap her around?" Okay. Page 61. King's listening to this, and what does he arrive at? It's I who should be pitied. It's I who am asked to give up part of myself, but I'll do my duty. I'll sacrifice her for the good of the people. It's only sense that one should die for many. Okay. So Arul says, "Give me instead." The king walks up to her, takes her by the wrist, walks her the whole length of the throne room to where his great mirror hangs, turns her around, and he says, "Ungit asked for the best in the land, and you'd give her that. Now be off. Put a beefcake on your face," meaning a steak. Okay? He doesn't say you're hideously deformed and ugly. He just turns around and says, "You'd give that to the son of a god." Okay. Page 63. She pushes off Redival and says, she's probably sorry in her own sense. She goes up to Istra's room. Bardia, after she finally butters him up enough, Bardia lets her in. And she goes in and she sees this image. Psyche, page chapter 7, Psyche sat upon the bed with a lamp burning beside her. Of course, I was at her arms. I was at once in her arms and saw this only in a flash, but the picture, Psyche, a bed, a lamp, is everlasting. Why?
Oh.
Yeah. Because that's the image that we will get from the story of Istra told in the second half of the novel by the travelers. Or not in the second half of the novel, but later on. Okay? Because what is the story of the myth of Cupid and Psyche? Psyche marries, quote unquote, Cupid, or Cupid kidnaps her, etc. He comes to her every night. She begs the god, can my sisters come see me? He says yes. He magically transports them to her house. Her sisters are married also, but they don't have nearly as good a spread as she does. And so they tell her that your husband must be hideously deformed. Take this lamp and this knife, and when you are asleep in bed, light the lamp, or uncover the lamp, look at your husband, and stab him, because he will be hideously deformed. And what happens? She pulls the cover over the hot lamp in the middle of the night. She looks at her husband, and he is a god. Literally, but looks-wise. He is a god. You know, do a mashup, ladies, of all your god actors, whoever they are. We just saw Hunger Games the other night, and my daughters would tell you, oh man, if you put Liam Neeson and the guy who plays Finnick together, that'd be one. I mean, take them apart, they're just fine. And what happens? She's sitting there staring at him, holding the lamp, and she spills hot wax on him. He wakes up in a fury, he flees, etc. It's that image: Psyche, a bed, and a lamp. Psyche sees her and says, what have they done to you? Notice, Psyche's up in her room. What's going to happen to her? She's going to get offered to the brute and eaten. And she's wondering, what's wrong with you? Okay. So they start to talk. How is Psyche taking the news? Rather well. She says, page 68, Arul, you make me think I've learned the fox's lessons better than you. Have you forgotten what we are to say to ourselves every morning? Today I shall meet cruel men, cowards and liars, the envious and the drunken. Notice what it doesn't say next. Screw the bastards. No. Flip them off and move on. No. What's it say? They will be like that because they do not know what is good from what is bad. In other words, they will be cruel men, cowards, liars, envious, and drunken. Why? Not because of some innate fault on their part, because they are ignorant, because they don't know any better. This is an evil which has fallen upon them and not upon me. So who is to be pitied? The cruel men, the cowards, the liars, the envious, and the drunken. They are to be pitied, not... And Arul cuts her off. Why? Why doesn't Arul allow her to finish? Why has Arul gone up to Istra? Has she gone up to comfort Istra?
No, she's gone up to comfort herself.
She's gone up to comfort herself, and what's Istra doing? She's not helping in the whole comforting thing. Okay? She says, oh, child, how can? And she's choked up. Psyche intervenes. Make me a promise you won't do anything crazy, all right? Right? Promise. Be like a soldier in a hard battle. Oh, your heart is of iron, is it? As for the king, give him my duty, or whatever is proper. She's just like Cordelia in King Lear. What does Cordelia say? When the king asks, okay, Goneril said she loved me this much. Regan said she loved me this much. How much do you love me? I love you as a daughter ought to love her father. No more nor less. I love you according to filial devotion. He doesn't like that answer. Okay? Give him my duty. That is, be appropriate. And as for Redival, send her your curse. Okay? Why? Why does Arul want Istra to curse Redival?
Because Laura wants to curse Redival.
Okay, and why else? because she thinks it's her fault. It's Redival's loose lips that has spread rumors. No, no. She also does what she doesn't know. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do, Christ says from the cross. Stephen says as he's being stoned, forgive them. They know not what they do. Not even for you, Psyche, will I pity Redival, whatever the fox says. Notice, I won't pity Redival. Do you want to be Redival? Would you like to be Redival? No? Then she's pitiable. What does she mean? Put yourself in her shoes for a moment. Okay? If you don't want to be like her, then pity her. Show pity to her. If I'm allowed to give my jewels as I please, you must keep all the things that you and I have really loved. Well, what are all the jewels that she has? What is she talking about there with jewels? She's not talking about taking off earrings and nose rings and bracelets and necklaces. Her jewels are her attitudes and emotions towards others that she is dispensing freely. Let her have all that's big and costly and doesn't matter. You and the fox, take what you please. In other words, you and the fox, you've always had my heart. Okay? And then she says, you're going to break my heart, and I'm going to be a bride. I'm getting married. Okay? They keep talking, bottom of page 70. Rural's voice, Psyche's voice kind of lowers a little bit. And she says, the priest has been with me. I never knew him before. He is not what the fox thinks. Do you know, sister, I have come to feel more and more that the fox hasn't the whole truth. Oh, he has much of it. Stop there for a moment. What part of the truth does the fox have? You know, take this as being all of reality. Divide it between the seen and the unseen. What does the fox have? He's pretty good up here. Not so much down here. This is what she's saying. The priest has a better idea of this. He calls, talking about the fox, the whole world a city. But what's a city built on? There's earth beneath. And what's outside the wall? Doesn't all the food come from there, as well as all the dangers? Things growing and rotting, strengthening and poisoning, things shining wet. In other words, okay, let's take the fox's image. You know, we'll use one tower as the city, and then you've got all these other buildings. But the city doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's got to have something that it's built upon. The fox only knows this part. What about all of this? That's what he doesn't understand. And then Arul, it never entered his mind, the foxes. He was too good, too good to believe that the gods are real and viler than the vilest men. Gods are real, only they're monsters. They're horrible. Or, Psyche offers an alternative. They are the real gods, but don't really do these things. Or even mightn't it be they do these things, and the things are not what they seem to be. That is, maybe the gods are real, and maybe the talk about the devouring is true. Maybe it is a real devouring. But we don't have the proper definition of the word devour to apply to it. Remember that we didn't talk about it, but remember the last chapter of Perelandra? It's usually called the Great Dance. Well, what do we see in that? You see this great dance, and every paragraph ends with "Blessed be he." You know, this is how Maladil made it. Blessed be he. Blah 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 blah. And what does it do? The emphasis, the focus, is constantly changing. And what happens when the dance centers on a grain of sand? What does that grain of sand become? It becomes the center of the universe. And then when it becomes a person, that person is the center of the universe. In other words, things aren't what they appear to be. There may be more to them than what we see. So this marriage or sacrifice or devouring, maybe these are all images of something. Something that we don't have words to describe. So because we don't have words to actually describe them, what do? We come up with words that we have to try to describe them. Okay? When the colonists arrived in America, they met animals that they didn't know. They met animals that they had no words for. Often what they did was they borrowed old words from the old country, even though the words that they borrowed and applied to those animals, okay, like a thrush, for example. There is a thrush, a kind of bird in England that we don't have or didn't have then, and yet because it kind of looked like it, they applied that. Well, what else do they do? Hampshire, New Hampshire. Jersey, New Jersey. York, New York, etc. Bedford, New Bedford. Okay? Same kind of thing. Different reality, so to speak. Okay? So, how if I am indeed to wed a god? And you just have to pause there for a moment. Notice what this does to Arul. Makes her angry. Okay? And so Psyche says, oh, I get it. Page 72. You think it does. You think it devours the offering. I kind of think so myself. It means death no matter what. But I mean, think about this. How can I be the ransom for all gloom unless I die? And if I am to go to the god, of course it must be through death. Now those of you, a couple of you have had the Christianity and literature or early Christian lit class with me. Who does that sound like, if you remember? St. Ignatius.
Yeah.
He wants to go to God. How must that happen?
This all sounds very
Through a devouring by a brute, by a beast. And if I am to go to the God, of course it must be through death. That way, even what is strangest in the holy sayings might be true. And as for death, we have made little use of the fox's teaching if we're to be scared by death. And yet the fox is scared by death. And you know, sister, he is sometimes let out that there were other Greek masters than those he follows himself. Ooh. Masters who have taught that death opens a door out of a little room into a great real place where the true sun shines and we shall meet something. Okay?
definitely talking about Plato there.
Yeah, definitely talking about Plato. So who are the masters that the Greek follows?
Aristotle, maybe?
Nope.
Or
Aristotle doesn't believe that when you die, you dissipate into nothing. If I remember right, it's Epictetus and Epicurus, who both essentially said, when you die, your body decomposes and that's it. There's nothing else. Okay. Talking about the opening from the little dark room into the great glorious sky, that's Plato. That's the allegory of the cave, or Socrates, an allegory of the cave. Okay?
So, here's an interesting thing about the positioning of this story. If we're to take that literally, presumably this is all happening well after the myth of Cupid and Psyche was originally composed, right? Or
No, not
well, no, 'cause
necessarily.
it shows up in Metamorphosis, which is Latin, and so it's a little bit later, isn't it?
It's the time of the myth.
Yeah.
Because later on, we hear the story gets transposed into a woman who had two sisters, and she marries a god, and the sisters are jealous, and Arul's like, no, that's not how it really happened.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's ancient Greece, 5th century, I don't know, something like that. So notice Psyche's trying to kind of calm a little bit Arul's concerns, and she's like, oh, okay. What about this? Let's say I don't go to the god, or let's say I don't become the offering, the devouring. What do I have to look forward to? Think about it. You don't think any mortal life seems a long thing to me tonight? How would it be better if I had lived? I suppose I should have been given to some king in the end. Perhaps such another as our father. You know, dear old dad. He's killed 3 wives already. Not literally, but... And there you can see again how little difference there is between dying and being married. Marrying him would be like a dying. Going to his bed would be really like dying. To leave your home, to lose you, mine and the fox, to lose one maiden's head, to bear a child. They're all deaths. What does she mean?
They're all a loss of something.
Yeah. In other words, you've been dying kind of all your life. The old you is gone. Whether the old you was 2 weeks ago, or the old you was yesterday, or the old you was 10 years ago. Okay? You're always kind of in this process of becoming. So what had I to look for if I lived? Is this world, this palace, this father, so much to lose? Now that probably doesn't do a whole lot of good to calm Arul's problem.
So she still has to deal
Because,
with all this stuff.
there's still me. What about me? You'd lose me. But then what is Psyche's kind of trump card? I've always, top of 74, at least ever since I can remember, had a kind of longing for death. A longing for death. C.S. Lewis said that when he first read George MacDonald, he crossed a threshold. And he said MacDonald baptized his imagination. Didn't suddenly make him a Christian where he's spouting Jesus every other word. That's not what he means. But he means MacDonald introduced him to the idea of the good death, rather than the kind of death that you see in German Romanticism that Lewis had been interested in at this time. Okay? Which is all stark and it's a horrible thing. It's kind of the Voldemortian view of death. The good death, the death that is beneficial, the death that is honorable and noble. Arul, Psyche, have I made you so little happy as that? Notice what Arul is pointed at, what she is thinking about, herself. Okay? Psyche, no, you don't understand. Not that kind of longing. It was when I was happiest that I longed most. On happy days when we were up there in the hills, the 3 of us with the wind and the sunshine, don't you remember? The color, the smell, and looking across at the gray mountain in the distance? Okay, that is an image straight from C.S. Lewis's childhood. Of he and his older brother sitting outside their home in Ireland, okay, and looking across I think it was a bay or inlet, to the Castlereagh Hills. And always kind of wondering, what's on the Dolores Hills. What's on the other side? This is before they both moved to England. And because it was so beautiful, it set me longing, always longing. Somewhere else there must be more of it. What's the it? It's not the gray mountain. It's the longing. Okay? George MacDonald's short story, The Golden Key. There's a line in there about the place from where, about seeing the shadow of the place from where all longing comes. Okay? Term that's used to describe this longing that Lewis is describing here is Sehnsucht. It's a German word. It doesn't have a translation in English other than longing. But it's not just like desire. This is an unfulfillable here longing or desire. It's the kind of desire or longing you experience, when you've had kind of those deja vu moments before, and you're like, oh, but it's the kind of deja vu that you want to go back to, where you've had something and you want more of it, and you try to do something to get that back, or like waking up from a dream, and you think, well, if I go back to sleep, I'll have that, and it doesn't happen. Okay? It's this desire that the mere desire is the cause of something else. Okay? So, she says, everything seemed to be saying, Psyche, come. Come. Okay? And a rule, we're told, she says, she kissed both my hands, flung them free, stood up. And she starts walking. Since I write this book against the gods, it is just that I should put into it whatever can be said against myself. So she says, I'm going to be honest here. And Psyche says, I am going, you see, to the mountain. To the mountain. Do you remember? Remember all my stories? To where the greatest king of all was going to build for me a castle? Oh, if only you could believe it. Ah, there's the problem. What is it? It's belief. Notice, Psyche has chosen all along to believe. A rule does not. Okay? It's very similar. We're just covering this in my Harry Potter and Tolkien course. It's very similar to what confronts Harry throughout Book 7. The choice to believe. Rowling put several times, it's like a half dozen times in the novel, it always came down to Harry must choose what to believe. Does he choose to believe his memories, his experience of Dumbledore, or does he choose to believe what other people say? And what problem does he always have? He doesn't want to have to choose to believe. He wants truth. Why? Because truth is incontrovertible. Truth is not something you can believe in. 2 plus 2 is 4. It always equals 4, whether you believe it or not. Okay? Everywhere, every time, all worlds, all places. Period. If it's a world of rationality and logic. Okay? If only you could believe it. Oh, shh. The sweetest thing in all my life has been the longing to reach the mountain, to find the place where all the beauty came from. That line is straight from The Golden Key by George MacDonald. Lewis wrote in his preface to an anthology he wrote of George MacDonald, I fancy I have never written a work where I did not quote from him. Okay? He goes on. She goes on. My country, my place, where I ought to have been born. Do you think it all meant nothing? All the longing? The longing for, what's the next word? home. The longing for home. Glome, Psyche is saying, is not my home. Yes, it's where I was born. It is not my home. Why? Because home is where all the longing is fulfilled. All my life, the god of the mountain. Oh, now this ties in nicely with marriage. Has been wooing me. I am going to my lover. Okay? How does Aurora take that?
Badly.
Yeah, badly. She can't accept it. What's one obvious reason why?
She doesn't believe it.
She doesn't believe it. What's another? Has she had the longing? No. No. She's never had, quote unquote, to her knowledge, a God wooing her. And yet Psyche, from the very earliest moments of her conscience or consciousness, seems to have felt, I belong over there. So, go on to the next chapter. Go to page 80. It's the time of the taking of Psyche, and Aurora tries to come down and passes out and can't make it. And we're told on page 80 that she was sick for several days afterwards, and she was raving mad, and she tells us, everything changed into something else before you could understand it. Okay? In her dreams, in her visions, she would see something and it would morph into something else. Yet the new thing always stabbed you in the very same place. Okay? Like a longing. It always hit her in the same place, even though it was very different from what was before. But one thread ran through all the delusions. Now mark again the cruelty of the gods. In other words, she's saying, these delusions came from the gods. There is no escape from them into sleep or madness, for they can pursue you into them with dreams. What does Hamlet say? Oh, if I were bound in a nutshell, I could be king of infinite space, were it not for dreams. Because dreams come from outside that infinite space. And if they come from outside that infinite space, then it ain't infinite. And there's something else. The nearest thing we have to a defense against them, but there is no real defense, is to be very wide awake and sober and hard at work. To hear no music, never to look at earth or sky, and above all, to love no one. Okay, the above all to love no one, that's pretty clear. Because if you fall in love with someone, what can happen?
Be taken away.
They can leave, or they can be taken away. It's kind of interesting, Lewis writes this after meeting Joy Gresham, and then she's taken away. Okay? But to be very wide awake and sober and hard at work, to hear no music, never to look at earth or sky, why? Why not do any of those things?
They're all things you can find pleasure in.
Bingo. Those are all things you can take pleasure in. What does Screw Tape tell Wormwood?
Make sure that your patient doesn't do anything that for its own sake, just because he enjoys it.
You let him go on the walk. You gave him an hour, he says, of what? Real pleasure. Taking in the woods and the stream and the meadow. Okay? Why? Because they can strip it all away. And she goes on and she says, in her fantasies, Psyche was her greatest enemy. All the sense of intolerable wrong was directed against her. Okay? But she comes out of this, and she's talking to the fox, page 84 and 85. And she asks him, "Do you still think Ungit is only lies of poets and priests?" And he says, "Well, why not?" And she says, "Well, okay, let's examine this for a moment. If she were indeed a goddess, what more could have followed my poor sister's death than has followed it? Because what happens after the sacrifice? The plague goes away, the rains come, everything's flourishing, everybody's happy. Why, the wind must have changed the very day. And what does he do? Chance. Cursed chance. It is these chances that nourish the beliefs of barbarians. But you've told me there is no such thing as chance." "You're right. Old trick of the tongue. I meant that all these things had no more to do with that murder than with anything else. They and it are all part of the same web which is called nature or the whole. The southwest wind came over 1,000 miles of sea and land." What's he saying? Lewis didn't use this terminology. The terminology didn't exist for 30 years after he wrote this. It's chaos theory. You know, butterfly flaps its wings in Beijing, and what does it do? It causes a hurricane in the Caribbean or something like that. The problem with chaos theory, there are so many variables, we can never know all the outcomes. That's what he's saying. There was not a cause and effect between her being killed and the sudden rainstorm. Why? Because the sudden rainstorm came upon a wind that started 1,000 miles away. The weather of the whole world would have to have been different from the beginning if that wind was not to blow. It's all one web. Charles Williams, another member of the Inklings, wrote about the web of glory, where he talks about everything is connected. Nothing exists independently. Tolkien didn't like Charles Williams as much as Lewis did. Tolkien thought Williams was too much of an influence on Lewis. In fact, he says Lewis was easily influenced by anybody. Okay? Tolkien was not easily influenced. So, Arul says, so she died for no reason, for no purpose. And you say this is comfort? No. He says this is not comfort. But their evil doing was vain and ignorant, as all evil deeds are. So notice, how does he try to comfort her? The next day he comes to her and he says, "You saw yesterday, daughter, how little progress I have made." Page 86. "I began to philosophize too late." In other words, philosophy hasn't been able to work its will on me. When he says I began to philosophize too late, he means I was too far along in my old ways before I learned how Greek wisdom can heal me of my problems with fate and such. To love and to lose what we love are equally things appointed for our nature. What does he mean? What is our nature? To die. This stuff is not made in such a way that it will continue forever. Why? Because it hasn't begun from forever. It came into being, which means it is temporal. It will go out of being also. Therefore, if we cannot bear the second well, what's the second? To lose what we love. That evil is ours. Now, when Lewis writes this, he knows Joy Davidman Gresham, Lewis, has cancer. But it's in remission. it did not befall Psyche. That is, that evil did not befall Psyche. If we look at it with reason's eye and not with our passions, what good that life offers did she not win? That is, what good things in life did Psyche not achieve or obtain? Chastity, temperance, prudence, meekness, clemency, valor, nobility, honor, loyalty. I mean, you could go on with the whole list of virtues, and she has them all. And he says, and her name, man, it would stand right up there with Iphigenia and Antigone's. But of course, they are lies, because they're not real. Okay? So, Arul asks her about Antigone and such. And he says, oh, how did Antigone earn fame? She went and buried her dead brother against the law of the land. And Arul thinks, I ought to go bury Psyche. So what does Arul do? She goes to work. And I don't mean she goes to work burying Psyche at this point. But she goes to work with Bardia. And she's been training with Bardia. In page 91, there's just a little kind of throwaway line or passage that Arul says, and she's talking about her training with Bardia. It was the hardest work I'd ever done. And while it lasted, one could think of nothing else. I said not long before that work and weakness are comforters, but sweat is the kindest creature of the three, far better than philosophy, as a cure for ill thoughts. Why? Why is sweat? Oh. Just thought of something. Why is sweat better than philosophy for curing ill thoughts? Or if you want to take by sweat, hard work.
Because philosophy involves thinking, whereas hard work doesn't. And so philosophy can occasionally bring you back to the ill thoughts, whereas hard work can't because it doesn't involve.
Have any of you had a course in 18th century? Read Samuel Johnson's Rasselas or Prince of Abyssinia? If you've not, you need to read that, because you meet an old man in there whose mind eats itself. And I don't mean literally, but because he's alone, what do depressed people tend to do? They turn inward and they just start thinking about all the things that are wrong, about all the ways they've failed, and those kinds of things. Okay? Philosophy doesn't necessarily get you out of that, because you're still doing what? You're sitting, and you're all turned inward. Hard work means you might still be thinking, but you're not sitting there philosophizing about the meaning of life when you're chopping down a tree, or, to use her example, learning how to wield a sword. Because if you're training against a trained swordsman against you, and you're sitting there wondering, well, why did Psyche say this? And not paying attention to that sword opposite you, you're going to get slapped with it. Okay? That's why sweat is better as a cure for ill thoughts. Okay? Go on a little bit. She and Bardia go off to bury Psyche. And the farther they get away from Ungit and Glom, the better she feels. Page 95. They're making their way, the mountain's out of sight. And we're told we'd come into the sunlight now, too bright to look into and warm. Heavy dew made the grass jewel bright. The mountain, skip the two parentheses. The mountain did not look like a solid thing. This is going to be important because later on, when she's at the mountain, on the other side of the mountain, she's going to look at something.
It won't be solid.
Well, it will
Well,
for a moment. Okay. And when she sees this, page 95, she sees the vast tumble of valley and hill, woods and cliffs, little lakes. And suddenly, she feels like singing. There came, top of 96, as if it were a voice, no words, but if you made it into words, it would say, "Why should your heart not dance?" And she feels the freshness and wetness all about her, and they make her feel that she had misjudged the world. It seemed kind and laughing, as if its heart also danced. Even my ugliness I could not quite believe in. Who can feel ugly when the heart meets delight? Okay. What's the difference between her ugliness and her heart? Where is her ugliness?
on the outside.
On the outside. It's the face. Where's the heart? It's hidden inside. Or is it the face, however? It is as if somewhere inside, within the hideous face and bony limbs, one is soft, fresh, lissome, and desirable. Let's use another image. For those of you familiar with Chronicles of Narnia, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. What happens to Eustace? He's turned into a dragon. Why? Because internally he is a dragon. So his external self matches his internal self. What happens as a result of turning into a dragon? His internal self becomes soft, fresh, lissome, and desirable. And Aslan has to undragon him. And what do we see once Aslan undragons him? A changed little boy. Always perfect? No, by no means. Better? Definitely. Okay? So, they keep going. And Arul is struggling with this. I'm going to stop pretty soon. Arul is struggling with this. Was I not right to struggle against this fool-happy mood? It's not right to be laughing while making her way to Psyche's burial. Reason called for it. Called for it what?
Sorrow.
Yeah, for her to be full of sorrow, for her to be dour, for her to be solemn. Right? But she thinks, I should be just like such a man if a mere burst of fair weather and fresh grass after a long drought and health after thickness could make me friends again with this God-haunted, plague-breeding, decaying, tyrannous world. Okay, notice what she's just said, though. Fresh grass after a long drought. Health after sickness. What is she emphasizing? By calling the world God-haunted, plague-breeding, decaying, tyrannous. That there's more plague and drought than there is health and water. I had seen. What had she seen? She'd seen people behave horribly? Yep, she had. What else had she seen? People behave honorably. The fox, her own sister. I was not a fool. I did not know then, however, as I do now, the strongest reason for distrust. The gods never send us this invitation to delight so readily or so strongly as when they are preparing some new agony. We are their bubbles, They blow us big before they prick us. It's almost like Gloucester talking about the gods to his son, saying they prick us for their pleasure. We are like flies to wanton boys. The gods just flick us around. Okay? She turns her back. Excuse me, they reach the last rise before the real mountain. And between them and the mountain lies what? A cursed black valley. Kind of like, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Okay, notice where it is. The sun's setting behind them. The valley is in shadow. And what's on the other side of the valley? The place of death. It is the valley of the shadow of death. When the sun rises, it's in the shadow of death. Okay? So they look up, and there, on the top of the mountain, she sees a single leafless tree. Now, I have no idea if Lewis did this or not. I mean, if he did this intentionally or not. But there's a very, very famous play. It's the hallmark of modern theater of the absurd. That has
Waiting for Godot.
one thing on stage, one prop, and it's a single leafless tree waiting for Godot. And what are they doing throughout that play? They're waiting for the character Godot, who may or may not be a character because he never shows up, who may or may not represent God. Okay? They go up to a tree that is used to do what? Strap a person to, who then waits for the God to come. I can't help but think Lewis intends for this image to come from
Well,
waiting for Godot.
at the same
Could be
time,
wrong.
it bears some resemblance to, like, for instance, Odin's sacrifice being, stabbed and left on a tree. For instance.
True.
Obviously, there's a
Cross.
Christ
Yeah.
imagery there.
Um,
I mean, I'm just saying there's other things.
okay, they make their way up, and we're gonna finish at the end of chapter 9. They make their way up. How far? Not nearly far enough. They go over the saddle. They look down into the valley on the other side. And what do they see? Page 100. And notice this is described as perilous land.
It's very holy.
That's how Tolkien describes fairy. Okay? It was like looking down into a new world. At our feet, cradled amid a vast confusion of mountains, lay a small valley bright as a gem, but opening southward on our right. Through that opening, there was a glimpse of warm blue lands, hills, forests far below us. The valley itself was like a cleft in the mountain's southern chin. High though it was, the year seemed to have been kinder in it than down in Globe. I never saw greener turf. There was gorse and gloom, wild vines, many groves of flourishing trees. Blah, 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 blah. Bardia says, this may well be the secret valley of the god. And there stood, not 6 feet away, on the far side of the river, Psyche. Okay, they're at the bottom. They go down to the bottom. She lifts her hands, and she hears 2 voices cry out. And she sees Psyche. Okay, we'll stop there. And we'll pick up there when we come back. Caitlin's going to, come on, Dave, wake up.